Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for coming back to visit. I'm so happy to have you here. Please mash that like button, subscribe if you can. If not, just share the videos, because I'm trying to get this out there. This isn't as much about me trying to come up with a way to make money as it is about me trying to get, to create a better world for my kids. And I think the best way for that to happen is if most of you understand better what the United States was founded on. So that's what I'm here to do. Now, if you haven't watched any of the prior videos, you do need to go back and watch them. They're in a specific order on purpose. This is not random. You need to understand what got us from the beginning to this point. Now, in my last video, we started in on what James Madison called the authorities that were necessary and proper to be abdicated to a federal government, right? Because the argument was made that we should have a nation. And Madison wasn't necessarily, he didn't like the idea of a nation. He didn't want a national power for the federal government. He wanted to create a confederacy, which it had been created, but he wanted to actually foster that confederacy and fix the problems that happened with the Articles of Confederacy. So the Constitution was born with the purpose of sending representatives in order to protect the sovereignty of the states and the sovereignty of the people, not to demolish the sovereignty of the states and to create a single national power. That was never the intent, and we discussed that in the prior videos. So today we're going to move on with some of those limited powers that he considered to be necessary and proper for the federal government. Now remember, he did say that, the first question you have to ask yourself is, does this power that I want to give them, is that something that the state could do? Or is it something that is too big for a state to do? And that's what it really comes down to. If the state could have done it, then the state will do it. But if not, then that's where the federal government comes in. And he listed off 6 powers in which the states would abdicate those powers up to the federal government for, in order to help the Union succeed. So what those powers are: 1, security against foreign danger, which we covered in the last video. The 2nd, regulation of intercourse with foreign nations. Number 3, maintenance of harmony and proper intercourse among the states. 4, certain miscellaneous objects of general utility. 5, restraint of states from certain injurious acts. 6, provisions for giving due efficacy to all of these powers. Now, as he listed those off, he explained in significant writings, in significant essays, what each of those things mean. So when you hear them, you might start thinking, well, that means this, that means this. You might be wrong. You might be right. I don't know. But that's what we're here to do today, is we're going to continue going through the 6 necessary and proper powers of a federal government. So like I said, we covered number 1 in the last video. Now we're moving on to number 2 on that list. So now we are going to talk about the regulation of intercourse with foreign nations. Madison came out and said, okay, after writing about the first, he came out and said, okay, the 2nd class of powers lodged in the general government consists of those which regulate the intercourse with foreign nations, to wit, to make treaties, to send and receive ambassadors, other public ministers, and consuls, to define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas, and offenses against the law of nations, to regulate foreign commerce, including a power to prohibit, after the year of 1808, the importation of slaves, and lay an intermediate duty of $10 per head as a discouragement to such importations. What? Wait, but Tucker, the Constitution, it allowed slavery because of the 3/5 clause, which we're going to get into one day. It made it okay for slavery, and that's what's wrong with the Constitution. If it's okay for slavery, then the whole thing is wrong, right? No, you are wrong. Sorry to bust your bubble, people. The Constitution never condoned slavery by any sense, and every bastardization that I've heard to that effect, everybody who has purposefully and maliciously misinterpreted the Constitution to suggest or imply that it in any way condoned slavery. That is, I can't even, there's not even a word. I mean, abhorrent, but it's far more than abhorrent. It means that you are trying desperately to gain authority over me by discounting the Constitution under false pretenses, so that, your freedoms were gathered on the backs of slaves, so you shouldn't have freedoms to begin with, which is what they're saying to us. But I digress. Can you tell I get a little upset about that? Yeah. So let's talk about that last sentence real quick, just for fun, okay? We'll go back to it, okay? So, including a power to prohibit, after the year of 1808, the importation of slaves, and lay an intermediate duty of $10 per head as a discouragement to such importations, as a discouragement for importing slaves. So there is the people who wrote the Constitution and arguing for the Constitution, explaining why the Constitution was a vessel to end slavery, to provide universal liberty. That was his explanation for that. Now you're like, oh, $10. Well, shoot, that's not much money. At that time, $10 would be what we see as nearly $200 today. So for every slave, they had to pay their tax of $200. That might not sound like a lot to you because you might be doing better than I am, but it was a lot, and it was hard to do, especially, one slave wasn't gonna pick the cotton. It was gonna take a lot. So they were doing everything they could to both unionize all of the states, all of the state nations, so that they'd all be protected, so that all of this individual liberty could, build up, so that they could create a foundation for liberty, while simultaneously trying to get rid of slavery. So, again, let's keep everything in context here. The delusion that there were old white men who wanted to own slaves is a lie. And it's a lie. And if you don't know it's a lie, now you do. So now you got to stop telling that lie. So, moving on, folks. You're going to love me today. I'm telling you, you've never not loved me the way you're not going to love me today. All right. So, he goes on and says, this class of powers forms an obvious and essential branch of the federal administration. And then he goes on to say, and this is important, okay? If we are to be one nation in any respect, it clearly ought to be in respect to other nations. What does that say to you? What is it? When somebody says, look, if we're going to come off as one nation in any way whatsoever, if anybody's ever going to think of us as one nation, that one way that they should think of us that way is only when it comes to how we deal with other nations who are no longer or never were a part of this union. So, that clarifies again and proves my point that, we were not ever meant to be a nation, that we are a confederacy. But the questions came up and the problems came up during the Articles of Confederation that led them to saying, look, we can't have 13 states making 13 different treaties and trying to out-treaty one another with outside forces, because that does not, what's the word I'm looking for? That does not foster harmony across the United States. So in order to foster harmony across the United States, they had to make it so that all of the states came together and found one consistent treaty with each outside country. Okay, does that make sense to you? I hope it does. If not, then I'm not doing my job right. But I think it's pretty obvious, right? So again, if we're going to be seen as a nation, it should only be in that other nations, when we're dealing with them, deal with all of us as if we were one nation. Okay? So, in those powers that we're talking about, what it takes to make all that work, what it takes to deal with foreign nations is, number one, to make treaties. Okay? So that was the first thing he brought up. Now, when you're talking about making treaties, there are, questions over whose laws are what. Because we all know that the president is, the guy who goes over there and deals with these foreign nations. So does that mean he has the power to make all these treaties? Does that? Is that what that means? It's not. It's not what that means. If you look at the actual Constitution, which is what we're here to talk about, right? If you look at the Constitution, what the president's job is very simple. The Congress itself, on the other hand, is responsible for, according to Article 1, Section 8, Senate's 2, to borrow money on the credit of the United States. 3, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. And then number 5 is to coin money, regulate the value thereof and of the value of foreign coin, and fix standards of weights and measures. Now, you should be able to see why it would behoove a union to all function within the same scope of the value of, coins and the value of international money and the value of each state's money. All that needed to be pretty consistent so that one state wouldn't do what was done prior to that, where one state would actually manipulate the value of their money so that they can, take advantage of other states. It wasn't working, so they decided they needed to come together. So those all fall within Congress. Now, I skipped over the sentences that were not related to making treaties, because what are treaties? Treaties are really all about, money, trade, right? Money, trade, and war is really all that treaties are for when it comes to dealing with outside forces. And within the scope of those, we already dealt with war on the first power, which was a power of Congress, not of the president. The president does not have the power over war. Go back and watch that video. And then when we're talking about treaties, once again, the president doesn't have the power to make treaties. All of that falls on Congress. The only job the president has, as is stated in Article 2, Section, Article 2, Section 2, I think it is. He shall have the power, by and with the advice and consent of Senate, to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur, and he shall nominate, and by and with advice and consent of Senate, shall appoint ambassadors. You see how that works? So the president, yes, he's the diplomat, and he appoints diplomats, but all of this is done within the scope of what Congress specifically expresses desire for. If Congress says no, then no. You don't. I'm president. I can do what I want. No, that's not how that works, buddy. Yeah, I need to read your Constitution. The way this works is that Congress decides how we should deal with these other nations, these outside nations, and from there they send the president. And mainly just because it's hard to send the 300, 200, 500, depending on what year we're in. Congress people over there to deal with one individual, right? So we had to determine to have one person whose job it was to go over there and actually do the negotiating on behalf of Congress. It would be kind of like saying that, well, I want to buy a car, but my wife and I, we're not really good negotiators. We can barely get along with each other, not to mention go into a store and argue over money. So we're going to hire somebody to go in and do it. He's going to execute the deal for us. So we hire this guy and we tell him, look, we want you to go into the local Ford dealership and buy me an F-150. And when you come home, I want that F-150 to have these things, but see what you can get, right? So, and then we send him, who is effectively Congress sending the president, over to the dealership. And then they come back and he says, here's your Toyota Prius with no bells and whistles. Wait a minute, that's not what I asked you to do. He's like, yeah, but it's my job to negotiate, and that's what I came up with. I mean, that's what it feels like today with our president, not this current one specifically, but in general, the way people look at the president is that he goes over there and he decides whether he wants a Prius or a F-150 or whatever on behalf of the people who sent him there. That's not how that's supposed to work. He's supposed to come back with his F-150 and with as many gadgets as he could negotiate into while he was at it. Do you see the difference? Does it make sense to you? So the power of all of this treaty stuff falls onto Congress. It's the negotiation that falls onto the president. It's his job to go over there and be the guy who actually talks them down on price and talks them into all the bells and whistles. But he doesn't have the authority to go over there and say, hey, look, they sent me over here to get an F-150, but I'm digging that Prius, so I'm getting it. No, that's not how that works. So this is all explained by Madison while he's talking about the Constitution when he's trying to sell it to the states. So moving on, let's move on to the third. Okay, the third power, the powers included in the third class are those which provide for the harmony and proper intercourse among the states. So we talked about the second one being, how do we deal with outside forces? Now the question is, how do the states interact with one another? What is the federal government's duty in terms of helping one state and another state get along in the process? Madison says, under this head might be included the particular restraints imposed on authority of the states and certain powers of the judicial department. And he goes on to say, but the former are reserved for a distinct class, and the latter will be particularly examined when we arrive at that structure and organization of the government. Now, I am with Madison on this. On the second part of that, when we're talking about the judiciary, the judicial department, we are going to cover that later in one of my later videos. So we're not really going to address that right now. We are going to address the first of those, which goes back to the particular restraints imposed on the authority of the states and that's it. So we're going to go back to those restraints. Number one, the first restraint put on the states, the first thing that the federal government's going to do on behalf of the states, and the states will not have the authority to do it outside of the government. The first of those things is to regulate commerce among the several states and the Indian tribes, to coin money, regulate value thereof, to foreign coin, all of these things. Now, the purpose of all those things is so that, like I said, the states don't get to, devalue money from other states so that they can take advantage of them. They can import things at lower values by their numbers, which is what we in China do right now, right? That's pretty much what's going on. So this kind of currency manipulation, that was a problem, and they decided to stop that. Now, I know this kind of overlaps in the other power, and that's why I'm covering them both today, because they are two overlapping powers, but they're two overlapping powers that do have distinct differences. So the next part of that would be to fix the standards of weights and measures. Now, it seems pretty obvious to me why everybody would want to use standard weights and measures, from one state to the next, one nation to the next. We're having this argument internationally as we saw the subterranean Land Rover that hit Mars a few years ago. Now, what does that mean? That means that one country was using meters and the other one was using feet, and they mismeasured because they put those two numbers together and they didn't come out right. So the Land Rover that was supposed to land on Mars went subterranean. It sunk into it. It didn't go well. And that's the problem. That is exactly what's the problem. When you have people working together, they need to be using the same measures of numbers. You can't have one state using yards and the other one using feet, and then in the other one using meters, and the other one using, whatever other measurement, that you can imagine. You can't have all that happening while they're all trying to work on the same things. So the federal government establishes, okay, so here's the rules. These are how we are going to measure things. These are how we're going to weigh things. When I say that it's 2 pounds of liquor and you bring it over my border, your 2 pounds and my 2 pounds are going to be the same 2 pounds, right? So that's what it all comes down to. Now, the third is to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. Oh my God, here comes the big one. This is the one that many of you have been waiting for. Now, I covered this in pretty good detail in a completely separate video when we were talking about kicking out all the illegals and how our founders looked at that, right? So if you want more in depth on this, you're gonna have to go over to that video. But let's go ahead and throw up some of the information that is actually written directly regarding the Constitution itself, not just, in the other video we talked about what happened when somebody tried to call people illegal immigrants. Let's talk about immigration law, how that actually really is supposed to work, how it was laid out by our founders, okay? So let's read a little bit, and then I'm not sure how much I'm going to make you read and how much I'm just going to talk over and sum up, because there's a lot here. So let's get into it. So in the 4th article of the Confederation, it is declared that the free inhabitants of each state's paupers, vagabonds, and fugitives from justice excepted shall be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of free citizens in the several states, and the people of each state shall, in every other, enjoy the privileges of trade and commerce, etc. So you see that there's different words being used here. Our founders were big on different words, and that's something we kind of have to nail down now. We have to understand that there is a difference between a citizen and a people, as in the citizen of a state are not necessarily the people. That is, people who have gained citizenship get certain benefits by becoming a citizen. But the people who are within that state, all people who are in that state, fall under the people. So we go back to it. It said that the people of one state shall, in all other states, enjoy the privileges and of trade and commerce with those states. You can see how that can be a problem. I'm going to go ahead and put up some of the other stuff here, and you can kind of read through it. There's a lot of things about free inhabitants and free citizens and all of this information. So you can look at those things and you can see, I'm gonna put a bunch up here. You're gonna see a lot. Now, if you want, just pause the video and read this and then come back and listen to what I have to say. But if you want to do both, or if you just trust me, then that's fine, however you want to go about it. So the problem they had was this, that it never really clarified the difference between citizenship, inhabitancy, residency, free inhabitants as opposed to enslaved inhabitants. And basically what it said was that everybody that was allowed into one state would enjoy all the privileges of citizenship in all of the other states. So that would, I'm trying to think of a good way to put that for you, but it basically means this. It means that if Florida, which is where I am, decides to let Mexicans in, but does not grant them citizenship, the fact that they live in Florida, they can use that and go across the border and automatically be citizenized by Georgia. So now they enjoy all of the citizenship benefits of Georgia. They're no longer just residents. And that was one of the failures of the Articles of Confederation. So, to fix that, to fix that problem, they came up with a system where, okay, so what we're going to have is basically two classes of people. We're going to have citizens, and we're going to have the people. So if you look at the beginning of the Constitution, it says we the people, not we the citizens, right? Because the people and the citizens are two different entities. The people, and it means everybody. It means all people have the rights. All people have the right to bear arms. Not the citizens have the right to bear arms. All of your rights, all of your constitutional rights, they're all protected, because what they are is they are rules against the government. They tell the government that it cannot do anything to any people regardless of citizenship. It's not their authority to do so. And understand that. When we get to the Bill of Rights, we'll talk more about that. But the point is, if you take, we saw that this happened and this was going wrong. And people were moving to one state to live, as a resident, but not a legal citizen, not a citizenized American. And then they would move over to another state and become citizen because of what was written. So what they did was they changed that. They said, all right, so we have your two classes. We're going to take anybody who is naturally born here is automatically a citizen of all states. So anybody who's born here as of this period is going to, or ever for that matter, is going to always have citizenship in every state. They can move freely from state to state, and they get to enjoy all the benefits that come along with it, all the privileges. Anybody who is not born here but wishes to become a citizen, who is not natural but wants to be made as if natural, which we call naturalized. So if they want to become naturalized, where they also get all of the benefits that you would get as a citizen, then they could go through a process that is determined by the entire Congress. It is decided on by Congress. So now Congress has the authority to decide who is a natural or naturalized citizen of any and all of the states. But that does not give them any authority over the people who are not natural or naturalized. The states still have authority and jurisdiction over residency. So that's something you need to understand. And I know it's hard for you, and like I said, go watch the other video. So we're going to move on because this is starting to drag out a little bit. Uniform laws of bankruptcy. This is something that is important and obvious, I think. He wrote it best. The power of establishing uniform laws of bankruptcy is so intimately connected with the regulation of commerce and will prevent so many frauds where the parties or their property may lie or be removed into different states, that the expediency of it seems not likely to be drawn into question. So keep in mind that we're saying that, look, we don't want to take powers that are yours. We don't want it to rob the states of any powers. So everything we're arguing here, all of these things is necessary and proper. Which powers are necessary and proper for you to give us? And, you know, look at this from the perspective of everybody was like, none. I don't want you to have any. And this is Madison saying, okay, well, this Constitution is written in a way so that you should be willing to agree with the ones that we are willing or that we should do, that we think are necessary and proper. And so when he gets to that, he says, look, you know, I don't think there's any argument that somebody who goes bankrupt in South Carolina should also carry that bankruptcy over into Virginia or Georgia or North Carolina or what have you, because we don't want them scamming people by going from state to state, building up all this money and then becoming bankrupt and then just running to the next state to get away from it. You see what I'm saying? So it was obvious, and the states all agreed pretty much. So there was no argument. That was all that he said about that. And it was clear that there was no reason to say anything about it. So getting on to the fifth and final, to prescribe the manner in which the public arts, records, and judicial proceedings of each state shall be proved in the effect that they shall have in other states and established. Look, this seems pretty obvious too, and he barely wrote anything about this because it's pretty obvious. When you're talking about, you know, building a postal system, he looked at that and said, you know, there's no way that having a federal postal system could be a problem for anybody, as long as it's not mandated, as long as it's an offering, as long as the federal government can say, here, we're facilitating posts. You know, we're facilitating roads. We're creating ways for you to be able to get information back and forth. No state would have any reasonable argument against that, I wouldn't think. Nor did they, nor did any of the states. When you look at all of their conditions of ratification, they all agreed. So, and yeah, that's something you may not know about. You know, not only did all of this Constitution come about, but there was actually a point when they were ratifying it that they all said, okay, I'll ratify it, but these are the conditions. And we're going to cover those in another video. You're going to have to watch so many videos. So listen, guys, that's enough for today, I think. I don't know how much battery I have left on my camera. For all I know, it's already out and I'm talking to the wind. So thank you so much. In the next video, we're going to move on to the next power and we're going to get through some pretty important stuff. Again, thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming out and listening to me and watching me and understanding all this. I really appreciate it. I love you guys. Thank you. Take care.
You heard a while, but that's just what people do. The theory is you always find somebody new. I guess there was a time I believe that was true.